In a city that never sleeps, where dreams are as ephemeral as neon light, lives Adrian Blackwood, a former artist who once touched the sky with his musical talent. Born in a small, peripheral neighborhood, Adrian always dreamed of the shine of the spotlight and the promising fame that seemed within reach. With a worn-out guitar and a raspy voice, he began his journey as a street singer, his sound charged with hope and desire. Adrian's rise to stardom was meteoric. His music has captured the hearts of many, and his passionate and intense live performances have attracted the attention of major producers. But the shine of fame is often dimmed by the shadows that accompany it. On a rainy night, as the city streets become a blur of lights and reflections, Adrian receives a message from an unknown number. The text, brief and enigmatic, simply says, "Your biggest dreams are on the verge of becoming reality. Come to the party tomorrow night." The invitation is simple, but the tone of the message worries him. The mystery that surrounds him causes uneasiness in Adrian, who finds himself torn between the excitement of a new opportunity and the growing discomfort that this message causes him. The response to this invitation will be the first step on a journey that will challenge everything he believes about success and the cost of his dreams. Adrian doesn't know, but what he's about to discover at the next party will be darker and more dangerous than anything he's ever imagined. Adrian Blackwood has always dreamed of the spotlight. Since he was little, he watched music stars and imagined the feeling of being on stage, with the audience applauding and cheering to his music. When the opportunity of a lifetime arose, he didn't hesitate to grab it with both hands. With each contract signed and each album released, the allure of fame became an intoxicating drug. The first time Adrian stepped onto the stage of a major theater, he felt a euphoria he had never experienced before. The deafening sound of the applause and the blinding brightness of the lights created a bubble of adoration around him, a bubble he didn't want to leave. His shows became eagerly awaited events, and with each new performance, his popularity grew exponentially. Fame, however, brought with it a new reality. Although Adrian's life was now filled with exclusive parties and celebrity encounters, there was a dark side that he was beginning to notice. Meetings with producers and executives were filled with a subtle pressure, a pressure that seemed to constantly whisper that he needed to adapt, to transform, to maintain his place in stardom. At first, Adrian thought this was part of the game. He was willing to do anything to achieve the success he always wanted. However, as time passed, Adrian began to notice small inconsistencies that he could not ignore. Some of the people around him began to act strangely, and the conversations behind the scenes seemed to carry a veiled tone of threat. With each new party or event, he noticed a growing sense of discomfort, a feeling that something was wrong. Despite his conflicted feelings, Adrian couldn't shake the magnetism of fame. The idea of returning to her previous life, away from the spotlight and adulation, was unbearable. He clung tighter and tighter to the ephemeral glow of stardom, ignoring the warning signs that were beginning to emerge, hoping that fame would continue to fill the emptiness he felt inside. The first signs that something was deeply wrong began to manifest themselves in subtle and disconcerting ways. During a particularly crowded show, Adrian noticed a strange feeling in the atmosphere, as if an invisible shadow was hovering over him. The energy in the audience seemed different, almost oppressive, and some of the coaching staff seemed restless, as if they were waiting for something he couldn't identify. In meetings with producers, Adrian began to notice a change in the behavior of those who had once supported him unconditionally. They became evasive, their answers to her questions about new projects and collaborations vague and charged with subtle tension. Certain conversations seemed to come to an abrupt halt when he entered the room, as if he were no longer welcome or as if there was a topic that should not be discussed in his presence. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during a recording session. Adrian was rehearsing a new song when the sound technician, a man who had always been kind and professional, suddenly started acting strangely. He seemed distracted and his attention was far away, almost as if he was trying to hide something. When Adrian tried to ask about a technical issue that was affecting the audio, the technician responded with a furtive glance and a quick apology before abruptly changing the subject. Furthermore, Adrian's nights began to be interrupted by disturbing dreams. He often woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, after having dreamed of disjointed images of distorted faces and enigmatic symbols. These experiences, although fragmented, were beginning to affect his mental state and his perception of reality. Adrian tried to ignore these early signs, attributing them to the stress and pressure that comes with success. However, the growing feeling that something was out of place could not be completely erased. Something was changing in the environment around him, and he couldn't fully understand what was behind these disconcerting changes. It was on a cold, damp night when the city seemed enveloped in a blanket of fog that Adrian received the invitation. The message arrived via an apparently anonymous email box, accompanied by an attached file. The invitation was a simple image, an elegant card with gold letters that said, "You are invited to an exclusive celebration." The signature was simply marked with an enigmatic symbol that Adrian didn't recognize, but which seemed charged with an aura of authority and mystery. Adrian couldn't ignore the intrigue he felt upon reading the invitation. The party promised to be a unique opportunity, a chance to connect with influential people and potentially further advance your career. However, there was something about the invitation that made him hesitate. The absence of details about the exact place and time, the anonymous signature, and the vaguely imperative tone of the message lit a spark of discomfort in his heart. The invitation seemed to align with Adrian's desire to explore new opportunities, and he decided he couldn't pass up this chance. However, before confirming its presence, he did a quick online search for the sender and symbol, but found nothing concrete. The lack of information only increased his uneasiness. On the night of the party, as he prepared to leave, Adrian felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He wore a dark, elegant suit, trying to project the image of an up-and-coming artist. The path to the party location seemed longer and more labyrinthine than usual, with deserted streets and a growing sense that something was out of place. Finally, he arrived at an isolated mansion in the middle of the forest, its outline dim in the light of the few lamps along the road. As you approached the entrance, the atmosphere of mystery and expectation was palpable. Adrian took a deep breath and prepared himself for what he hoped would be a life-changing event. The wrought iron gate slowly opened, revealing a majestic entrance, and he found himself pulled into a world that did not seem to be the same as the one he had plunged into. Upon crossing the mansion's threshold, Adrian found himself immediately enveloped in an atmosphere that defied simple description. The decor was opulent but strangely sinister. The main hall was adorned with a mix of contemporary art and bizarre sculptures that seemed to have a life of their own. The lights were soft and diffuse, casting shadows that danced across the walls like specters on a witch's night. The environment was filled with soft, almost hypnotic ambient music, which seemed to infiltrate Adrian's thoughts and affect his emotional state. The walls were decorated with tapestries of fabric that seemed to pulse slightly, and the sensation of being inside a large living organism was unsettling. The guests were a parade of enigmatic figures, dressed in extravagant clothes and stylized masks that covered much of their faces. People's behavior was equally disconcerting. They spoke in whispers and moved with an almost predatory grace. Adrian felt a constant gaze on him, and the feeling of being watched only intensified his discomfort. As he moved around the hall, trying to adapt to the strange surroundings, he noticed that some of the figures present seemed to be in a trance-like state, as if they were under some kind of influence. Conversation floated around him. Fragments of discussions about the grand plan and what's to come appeared like echoes in his mind. The buffet was another disturbing aspect of the party. The dishes were exquisite, but Adrian couldn't identify the ingredients. The food had an almost surreal appearance, with colors and shapes that defied logic. With each bite, he felt a slight discomfort, as if he was consuming something more than just food. With every minute that passed, Adrian felt more out of place and less safe. The party, which was supposed to be a celebration of success and achievement, was turning into a maze of distrust and fear. He was beginning to understand that what was about to happen could surpass anything he had ever faced in his life. The interior of the mansion was a stark contrast to the expected glamour. The Great Hall was lit by ancient chandeliers, the flames of which cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with bizarre tapestries and sculptures that seemed to capture moments of anguish and despair. Adrian felt a chill down his spine as he looked around. The decor was opulent, but it carried an unsettling feeling that he couldn't explain. As he mingled with the crowd, Adrian began to notice the peculiarities of the other guests. There was a woman with intricate symbolic tattoos running down her neck and arms, each one with a meaning that Adrian couldn't decipher, but which seemed to suggest a connection to something hidden. Her eyes were a deep, unforgiving green, and she moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Among the guests, there was a strange sense of conformity. Many were in small groups, muttering among themselves in a language Adrian couldn't fully understand, and their expressions were dull, as if they were trapped in a trance. A tall, gaunt man, dressed in a black suit that seemed to blend into the shadows, was talking to a group of people on a street corner. and Adrian couldn't help but notice the way he was watching them, as if he was analyzing their every move with unsettling precision. While trying to fit in, Adrian encountered a group of individuals whose clothes were a mix of ancient and modern styles, as if they came from a different era. They talked with frantic intensity, their exaggerated gestures and furtive glances adding to the sense of discomfort. Amid this scenario, a soft and hypnotic sound of ambient music filled the space. Mixed with the whisper of conversations and the clink of glasses, Adrian realized he was being watched, and the feeling of being the center of a silent experiment began to grow. Guest interactions were courteous, but there was an underlying tension, a feeling that any false move could trigger something unpredictable. The oppressive atmosphere of the party made Adrian feel out of place, as if he were in a nightmare where the rules were unknown and at any moment, the apparent normality could dissolve into chaos. He tried to focus on maintaining a calm appearance, but the feeling of being constantly evaluated and the strangeness of the guests were beginning to weigh on him. As Adrian moved around the room, taking in the strangeness of his surroundings, a growing sense of uneasiness began to wash over him. It was during a conversation with one of the guests, a middle-aged man with a tired look and an aura of disappointment, that Adrian began to understand the true subtext of the party. The man, noticing Adrian's curiosity, made a vague gesture for him to follow him to a more private corner of the room. There, away from the curious eyes of the other guests, the man began to speak in a low and serious tone. "You've noticed, haven't you?" he began. "How come everyone here seems different, like they're trapped in some kind of enchantment?" Adrian looked around, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "There is something very wrong with this industry," the man continued, his voice shaking slightly. "What you're seeing here is just the surface. Behind the curtains, fame and success are manipulated by forces that are beyond common understanding." Adrian frowned. "Forces? What are you talking about?" The man hesitated for a moment, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. "There is a secret network that controls not only fame, but also the minds of artists. The people you see here, they are changed. They have been shaped by something you can't see, but that affects every part of your life and career." The revelation came as a shock to Adrian. The idea that the music industry, something he had envisioned for so long, could be under the control of a hidden force, was almost impossible to accept. But the man's words and the dark atmosphere of the party began to make sense in a disturbing way. The party, with its strange decor and enigmatic guests, now seemed like a glimpse into a world he was beginning to understand, but did not yet fully understand. The soft hypnotic music that filled the room seemed to have an almost sedative effect on the guests. Adrian tried to adapt to the surreal atmosphere of the party, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was deeply wrong. The hall was full of people, but a feeling of opacity and conformity dominated the environment, as if everyone was under a collective spell. It was during a seemingly innocent conversation with a renowned producer that Adrian began to realize the gravity of the situation. The producer, a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze, made a casual comment about the changing nature of the mind. While discussing the creative challenges, Adrian found the comment peculiar, but it was the distant look and cold reaction of the other guests that really disturbed him. The producer continued speaking, his tone soft and persuasive, almost like hypnosis. Adrian noticed that other artists around him also seemed to be in an almost somnambulistic state, their responses automatic and their expressions blank. It was as if they were following a predetermined script, their reactions and behaviors meticulously adjusted to align with an invisible pattern. During a lull in the conversation, Adrian began to make disturbing connections. Talk about how the mind can be shaped, and the importance of being aligned with expectations began to sound like pieces of a sinister puzzle. The idea of mind control, which previously seemed absurd, began to make sense as he observed the artists around him. He remembered rumors he had heard about famous figures who had disappeared or become unrecognizable, not just from the stress of fame, but from profound and unsettling changes in their personalities. Now, these stories felt more real than ever. Adrian began to see patterns in the way the guests interacted with each other, as if they were being manipulated in subtle ways. The idea that he might be being manipulated also began to torment his mind. The feeling of being trapped in a web of control and influence, with every step carefully orchestrated, was suffocating. The concept of mind control now seemed not only plausible, but a disturbing reality that he was only beginning to understand. Adrian's growing discomfort and restlessness turned into a devastating internal conflict. As the party continued, he found himself torn between the desire to remain on the threshold of success and the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every courteous smile and friendly greeting from the other guests seemed laden with hidden intent, an attempt to maintain the facade of normalcy while something more sinister was going on behind the scenes. Adrian felt constant pressure to conform, to maintain a public image that was not just a representation of who he really was, but a version shaped by the expectations of the powerful who controlled the party. The feeling of being observed and evaluated was always present, like an invisible weight that pressured his emotions and decisions. His mind struggled to process the new information and the growing realization that the music industry was not what he had imagined. He felt like he was on the verge of discovering something that could change not just his career, but his life. The idea that he might be being mentally manipulated was terrifying, and the conflict between his ambition and his fear was becoming unbearable. The decision to continue with the party or try to escape became increasingly difficult. The prospect of leaving the party and facing the unknown outside seemed as daunting as the event itself. Adrian was caught between the lure of fame and the growing feeling that he was falling into a trap. The internal struggle between the desire to succeed and the need to preserve his freedom and sanity was reaching a breaking point. As the party continued and the conversations around him became increasingly enigmatic, Adrian knew he needed to make a crucial decision. The choice between submitting to the silent control of the party or seeking a way to escape became a question of survival. With each passing moment, the feeling of being entangled in a web of manipulation and deceit became more intense, and the fear of what he might discover next began to come to fruition. The discomfort and fear began to turn into a palpable urgency for Adrian. The realization that he was surrounded by forces he didn't fully understand sent his mind into a state of maximum alert. As he watched the party with new eyes, the desire to escape became a desperate need. Adrian searched for a discreet exit, but each time he tried to move away from the crowd, he found himself more lost in the labyrinthine mansion. The hallways seemed to stretch and twist, and the doors closed automatically, as if the building itself was conspiring to keep him trapped. His heart was beating fast and his hands were sweaty, which only increased his sense of claustrophobia. Finally, after dodging several groups of guests and avoiding the sinister figures that watched him with calculating gazes, Adrian found a door that seemed to lead to an outside garden or courtyard. He headed there, believing he could find a way out of that oppressive mansion. However, as soon as he opened the door, he realized that the garden was not a space of freedom, but a trap. There was an area lit by cold lights and a series of security figures, dressed in dark costumes and discreet earpieces, patrolling the space. Adrian tried to sneak behind one of the grotesque sculptures, but his movements were noticed. He felt a rising panic as he saw the security figures begin to approach, their ruthless expressions and coordinated behavior revealing frightening effectiveness. The tense moment intensified when Adrian tried to make a quick detour towards a darker area of the garden. The ground seemed to move beneath his feet, and the feeling of being followed was almost unbearable. Every step he took seemed to be watched, and the sound of hurried footsteps behind him only heightened the sense that capture was imminent. His desire to escape was mixed with a feeling of helplessness, and he knew he needed to think quickly to find a way out. Fear turned to determination, and he struggled to remain calm as he searched for an escape route that could take him away from those menacing figures. The tension was at its highest point, and every movement seemed crucial to his survival. As Adrian struggled to find a way out, a figure suddenly appeared in the darkness of the garden, moving with unexpected agility. It was a woman, dressed in a long coat that seemed to merge with the shadow. She approached Adrian with a calm confidence and a look that conveyed a deep understanding of the situation. "You need to get out of here now," she said in an urgent but controlled tone. Adrian was so surprised by the woman's appearance that he almost didn't react in time. Without hesitation, he followed her as she headed to a more protected and hidden area of the garden, away from the security patrols. The woman seemed to know the terrain well and guided Adrian with precision, avoiding the lights and paths where security was most concentrated. She introduced herself as Ava, a former associate of the producer who was involved in the darker aspects of the music industry. Ava explained that she had a deep understanding of the mansion's secrets and the control mechanisms that supported it. However, just when Adrian thought he had found an ally, the scenario changed abruptly. Ava, with an enigmatic look, offered help to escape and promised to guide him to a safe place. But as they approached a promised exit, Adrian began to notice a series of signs that raised doubts. The way Ava avoided direct questions and the speed with which her help seemed to be arriving just as security approached raised suspicions. Tension grew as Adrian began to feel something was wrong. The unexpected help that seemed to be his salvation could also be a trap in disguise. The mystery surrounding Ava and the perfect timing of her intervention left a feeling of unease that Adrian couldn't ignore. He was torn between the urgent need to escape and the growing distrust of his new guide's true intentions. Adrian was determined to escape, and the feeling that capture was imminent drove him to find a way out. In the garden, as he ran through the shadows and tried to hide, he saw a small side door that seemed to lead to a less lit corridor. Without thinking twice, he threw himself towards the door, his heart beating wildly and his body on high alert. Walking through the door, Adrian found himself in a narrow, dark hallway. The lack of lighting made vision difficult, but he could make out a few doors along the walls and the distant sound of murmurs and footsteps. The feeling of being in a labyrinth felt more and more real. With the corridors intertwining and unfolding into an intricate web of paths, Adrian knew he needed to stay calm and choose his path carefully. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, and with every corner he turned, he found more doors and passages that led nowhere. However, he could not afford to hesitate. The sound of security got closer and closer, and he knew he needed to act quickly. With a growing sense of panic, Adrian began to run, his breathing heavy and his footsteps echoing off the walls. Finally, he spotted a window at the end of the hallway. It was a small, old-fashioned glass window, but it seemed to be his only chance of escape. Adrian ran towards her, his muscles tense, and his mind focused on a single goal: freedom. When he reached the window, he tried to open it, but it was locked. Desperately, he looked for something to break the glass, and managed to find a piece of rusty metal on the floor. With a strong and precise blow, he broke the glass and prepared to leave. With the glass broken, Adrian managed to climb through the window and into a smaller outside garden, which appeared to be a storage area. The feeling of being out of the mansion and into the cold night was a temporary relief, but he knew he couldn't stop. The escape was far from complete, and security was still behind him. After escaping the mansion, Adrian found himself in a state of exhaustion and disorientation. The garden outside was a gloomy, cluttered area filled with piled-up tools and boxes. Adrian hid behind a stack of boxes, his body shaking from the cold and adrenaline. The silence of the place contrasted sharply with the chaos he had just experienced, and he used this moment to try to gather his thoughts and plan his next steps. He knew that if he wanted to escape successfully, he needed to find a safe place where he could hide and recover. The first thing he did was check his cell phone to see if there was a signal and if he could find any information that would help him. Unfortunately, his cell phone was almost out of battery, and he realized he needed to get to an area where he could get help. With renewed determination, Adrian stood up and began walking down the country road that extended beyond the mansion's grounds. The road was empty and deserted, and the night was shrouded in deep darkness. The rural setting felt strange and threatening, and Adrian felt a growing sense that he was being watched, even though he was far from the mansion. After a few hours of walking, he spotted a small country house in the distance. With a faint light visible through the windows, it was a welcome sight, and Adrian decided this would be his temporary refuge. The house looked abandoned, but he didn't have many options and needed a place where he could rest and think clearly. Upon arriving at the house, Adrian tried the door, and, to his surprise, it was unlocked. He entered carefully, making sure there was no one inside. The house was dusty and apparently unoccupied, but it offered much-needed shelter. Adrian laid down on the cold floor and began planning his next steps, his mind still spinning with the confusion and fear from last night. He knew he needed to understand what was happening and find a way to expose the truth, but for now, survival was his priority. After a frantic escape through the mansion and subsequent leap through the window, Adrian found himself in a small outdoor garden, surrounded by tall trees and a sense of isolation that contrasted sharply with the chaos he had left behind. The area was a service yard of sorts, with stacked boxes and gardening equipment, all covered in a layer of dust and foliage. The air was cold and the night was dark, and Adrian felt that every noise could be a sign that safety was approaching. Adrian needed to find a safe place, away from the watchful eyes of security guards. He walked cautiously through the garden, keeping to the shadows, and found a small rusty iron gate. The gate was partially open, as if it had been used recently. Without hesitation, he pushed him away and slipped out of the mansion's grounds. Outside, the environment was an open field, and Adrian felt a little freer. The feeling of being free from the mansion was relieving, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. He began walking down a path that seemed to lead away from the mansion, hoping to find some kind of shelter or help. The path was winding and surrounded by dense vegetation, but Adrian stood firm, determined to find a safe place where he could hide and plan his next steps. After a few kilometers of walking, he arrived at a small isolated cabin, apparently uninhabited, hidden among tall trees. The cabin seemed an unlikely refuge, but it offered a chance for rest and temporary protection. Adrian entered carefully, checking that there were no signs of occupation. The interior was dusty but felt solid. He leaned back against the wall, trying to catch his breath and take stock of what had happened. In the silence of the cabin, Adrian reflected on the tumultuous night and the terrible reality he had discovered. The feeling of having escaped the invisible prison of the mansion did not erase the uneasiness he felt about what was really behind that event and the broader implications. He knew he needed to be cautious, and that the situation was not yet resolved. With morning approaching, Adrian knew he needed to act quickly. The cabin was a good temporary hiding place, but he couldn't stay there forever. He decided the next step would be to try to find out more about what was really going on in the music industry and find a way to warn others who might be in danger. While examining the cabin's surroundings, Adrian found some basic utensils that could be useful. He prepared a small meal from what he found, trying to maintain his energy and mental clarity. I knew that in order to deal with the situation effectively, I needed to better understand the structure and figures behind the party and the mind control I had perceived. He began planning his next move, considering the information he had and the risk he still took. His priority now was to find out who was behind all this and how he could expose the truth. Adrian knew he had to act with discretion and strategy to avoid being captured again or further damaging his efforts. In the meantime, he felt compelled to document his experience and discoveries, perhaps even create a cautionary tale for other artists and industry professionals. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders was heavy, but Adrian was determined not to let the terror and manipulation he had faced go unpunished. If you like this narrative and want to follow more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you more fascinating and exciting content. Until next time.